Well, just before we go on with the third section, it might just be good to remind ourselves of some important people. So we have, of course, St Anselm of Canterbury, who's famous for the ontological argument, or at least one of the versions of Aquinas in the 13th century. You remember that Aquinas is a huge fan of Aristotle and essentially just tried to make him a little bit Christian. You see him here actually. This is a picture taken in the Vatican. Incidentally, he is before the throne of Mary. She's saying, "You've written well of me, Thomas," and he is pointing to Aristotle, who is giving him a scroll that says philosophy. And then there's Hume, of course, in the Enlightenment period, and slightly before him, Paley. You remember that Paley is famous for the teleological argument, and Hume comes across as a skeptic. So we're going to see Polkinghorne discuss these people, and it's just good to remind ourselves of their dates. So here we go. The Middle Ages saw the first great flowering of natural theology. Its mode was largely the appeal to reason, its purest form the ontological argument of St Anselm. The latter offers the dazzling prospect of something for nothing, the deduction of the existence of God, defined as that than which no greater can be conceived, simply from an analysis of the implications of that definition. The claim is that what exists is greater than what does not exist. Such a being must, in order to attain its maximal status, include existence among his attributes. I'm just going to remind you of this, and the way that I like to sort of represent it is to draw a theta. So we'll just call that than which nothing can be exist. We'll call that theta, and then we'll say that there could be, if you remember, being that doesn't, than which no greater can be conceived, that exists in reality. So this is in reality. And the alternative is in intellectu, which is the mind. So let's have an I for intellectu. And we see straight away that a being than which nothing greater than me can conceived that exists in reality is, of course, superior to a being than which nothing greater than can be conceived that exists only in the mind, because, of course, it is inferior to the one that exists in reality. And so, actually, that means, therefore, that theta I, if you like, the being that exists only in the mind, is not actually that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So it only can be that than which no greater can be conceived if it exists in reality. That's, of course, as you remember, Anselm's argument. And he goes on to say that the instinct that this was too clever to be true was confirmed when Kant pointed out the illegitimacy of treating existence as a defining predicate. Its logical status is quite different, namely the assertion that there is an instance of what is defined by true predicates, in this case the predicates of omnipotence, omniscience, etc. Thus the ontological argument fails in its logically coercive intent. The existence of God cannot be smuggled into the divine definition, and so it remains a logically open question. I think that's worthy of remembering that little soundbite. And I think this idea of it being open is important to Polkinghorne. He doesn't want to just solve the question, if you like, by a bit of a name game. Now, we don't really have the time to go into the ontological argument, but of course do look up that section in your anthologies and in your texts. The question of whether Kant's criticism is actually completely successful will depend on whether you think that there might be something rather different about necessary existence. Anyway, to continue. This conclusion survives ingenious attempts to get around it by claiming that aseity, that is to say the property of a necessary being, as opposed to a merely contingent being, is a predicate required for maximal status. There is a distinction to be maintained between internal logical necessity, given a definition, and actual necessity, that is, necessity of an instance of the definition. If that than which no greater can be conceived rightly has aseity among his attributes, all that enables us impeccably to deduce is that if there is a God, then he exists necessarily, in the same way that we can deduce that there are numbers greater than 999 if we accept Peano's axioms for arithmetic. But just as we can conceive of mathematical systems with a limited number of integers, so we can conceive of worlds in which God does not exist without committing any logical impropriety. Atheism is not an incoherent possibility. Another good soundbite, I think, there. Just remember to make these links to the arguments of the existence of God. Aquinas never accepted Anselm's reasoning. However, in the 5 ways he sets out his own natural arguments for the existence of God. They are less austerely abstract than Anselm's, for they take account of certain facts about the world and aren't exclusively logical in character. So, i.e., they are a posteriori. However, the facts appealed to it are mostly very general, such as the existence of the world and of change within it, so that the emphasis is still very much on the exercise of reason. In summary, we might say the 5 ways appeal to, firstly, the existence of change, so there has to be a first originator of change. Secondly, the existence of causation, there has to be a first cause. Thirdly, the existence of coming to be and ceasing to be, so the world's actual continuance requires an unchanging ground of its existence. Fourthly, the existence of gradations, of qualities, so there has to be one whose perfection is the ground of all partial qualities. And finally, the existence of purpose in the world, so there is necessity of an intelligence directing it. In each case, the conclusion leads to the postulation of a being of whom it can be said, and all understand this to be God. Only the last of the 5 ways appeals to a rather specific aspect of the world, and is, we might say, teleological. Remember, it's about the archer. In your notes, remember that the first 3 are cosmological. The one from gradation is interesting. You could actually make a case for it being almost a priorized. It sort of borrows some aspect, I think, of Anselm's ontological argument. But it does start with the observation that we find a gradation of things. So heat, some things are hotter than others, and there has to be a maximum. But you could kind of make a Platonic version of this argument. And actually, I think there is some room for sort of mashing in a bit of Descartes there as well. But that's a bit of an aside. Let's carry on reading. The 5 ways are variations on 2 grand themes of argument for God's existence, namely the cosmological theme, the fact that the world requires some exploration, as Leibniz's great question puts it, why does something exist rather than nothing? And the theme of design, the pattern and process of the world exhibits a fruitfulness which speaks of purpose rather than blind chance. In terms of intellectual compulsion, the 5 ways are no more coercive than the ontological argument. Hume was to have a lot of shrewd fun at their expense. Of course, there has to be some rock-bottom starting point in our account of the world, but why may not the material universe be necessarily existent? Ought we can confirm it, matter, may contain some qualities which, were they known, would make non-existence appear as great a contradiction as twice 2 is 5. Physics has explored the possibility of a self-sustaining role for matter in a way that has escaped the notice even of Hume's audacious intellect. This is the notion of the bootstrap, a self-consciously constructed counter to the orthodox physical view that matter is composed of identifiable constituents. To the bootstrapper, there are no basic elementary particles, rather everything is made out of everything else. that breathtaking possibility that the world has lifted itself into existence by its own bootstrap, so to speak, is conceivable in modern physics when particles are made out of other particles by a force holding them together, and where that force is itself due to the exchange of particles between particles. Right, let's pause here, and I actually recommend watching a video. There's a Doctor Who video in this in the link on this now. So watch that, and you'll see the idea of essentially a bootstrap paradox, whereby there's no definable cause because it's sort of circular, and this is sort of what he's talking here. And frankly, so I would, in your text, I would sort of say the bootstrap, just refer to Doctor Who bootstrap paradox, and then here this is basically just technobabble, and you don't really need to understand again all the physics. All you need to understand is that he's appealing to this notion that there might be some possibility that actually, instead of there being a first cause, the universe sort of caused itself. It's apparently logically possible, and so honestly, don't worry if you are getting a bit bemused by all this physics. I'll carry on reading though. This double role of particles as carriers of force and consequences of force enables us to think of the possibility of particles making themselves out of themselves in a recursively self-consistent way that identifies carrier and consequence. One of the proponents of this idea, Geoffrey Chew, rather charmingly called it a nuclear democracy, and nothing is more elementary than anything else. The bootstrap enables us to think of such a possibility, but I must add that no one has succeeded in constructing a theory that did more than approximate in a crude and unsatisfactory way to the idea. Moreover, there is good reason to believe that there is an elite of elementary particles, the quarks and gluons, out of which matter is in fact constructed, rather than a democratic egalitarianism holding sway. So, I think the reason that I would say to skip over the physics is because very often in this book he's arguing about certain parts of quantum physics that frankly are highly specialized. I think what's important to note though is that clearly different physicists have different interpretations of available data. So when people make out that physics or science, the natural sciences are all cut and dried, it's simply not true. There's room for interpretation and difference of opinion here. And I think it's important here to point out, as he says, that at the moment it's essentially conjecture. This bootstrap thing, it sounds like a nice idea, but when he says no one's put it as theory, he means no one's worked out the mathematics, etc. of it and modelled how it could actually be the case. So that's really the point to take away there. Let's return then to Hume. So as for Hume's view on design, he points out that the perfection of the world is very questionable. The world, for aught anyone knows, is very faulty and imperfect compared to a superior standard, and was only the first rude essay of some infant deity. There's such a great little soundbite from Hume there. One must acknowledge that the world often presents an ambiguous face when we seek in it to discern signs of benevolent design. Religious believers are sometimes prone to take too facile a view of its perfection. Many years ago, there were two sets of films in circulation concerned with the character of the living world. One set, made by the Moody Institute of Science as items of Christian apologetic, concentrated on comfortable aspects of the remarkable way in which life is adapted to its environment. The other set, made by the Disney organisation without any metaphysical axe to grind, while not oblivious of the benevolent side of nature, portrayed also its more ruthless aspect. The roles of predators and disease were not overlooked. This would have come as no shock to the biblical writers. The psalmists, in particular, are open to the whole range of experience. The lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. Now, I think this is a very nice passage to kind of compare to Hick and his idea of the world as not being a pleasure sort of dome or paradise or gilded cage for some pet. So it relates to the problem of evil here and the doctrine of creation, and that's important. Also compare it to, it might even contrast to the idea of the best possible world, which you'll find in Leibniz. So a nice link for you there. Let's carry on with this. For my loins are filled with burning, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am utterly spent and crushed. I groan because of the tumult of my heart. Okay, tell it like it is then. Continued sifting of the arguments from both existence and design. 5. By the way, do note when he's also alluding to or quoting scripture. As a theologian, remember, if we go back to previous slide, and we talked about the different sources of authority here, scripture is always going to be one for theologians, as in believing theologians, that is, at least. And he's writing, as a person of Christian faith. So for him, that's going to hold authority. Let's carry on. Continued sifting of the arguments from both design and experience has confirmed their shakiness in regard to proof. However, that should occasion neither surprise nor dismay. Outside of mathematics, there is very little that enjoys an incontrovertible degree of certainty. Yes, completely agree. Nice link to epistemology there, of course, and be very careful if you're using the word proof in a philosophy essay. However, Polkinghorne goes on to point that even there, Gödel's theorem indicates that an act of faith is necessary concerning the consistency of the system being considered. This is Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which, as a non-mathematician, I can't really explain to you, but is worthy of a Google if you really want to know. You can take the point as an aside anyway. So hence, there is no infallible way of demonstrating the error of the man who claims that the world came into existence 5 minutes ago. He is logically vulnerable in his preposterous position, and much good may it do him. Whatever Aquinas himself may have thought to be the character of his arguments, their true nature is not of that of knockdown demonstration. It's something more subtler than that. So here really he's talking about the purpose of the arguments for God, not as proofs. Commentators on Aquinas agree that when he speaks of a first cause and so on, his concern is with a logical hierarchy rather than temporal priority. It is not that God is an originating cause in the remote past, like the fiery explosion of the Big Bang in physical cosmology, but that he is a fundamental cause in and of the present. In other words, the search for a first cause is a search for the deepest possible understanding of what comes to be, as it comes to be, and a similar search for understanding can be said to characterise the rest of the 5 ways. They are pointers to the divine as the only totally adequate ground of intelligibility. Aquinas' rejection of the possibility of an infinite regress, so strange to us who naturally think of infinite series, is the assertion that there is an attainable, comprehensible understanding of all that is. If that is so, it would not seem inappropriate that all should understand that this is God. Thus conceived, the aim of natural theology is not demonstration of the divine beyond a peradventure, but rather an understanding of the world through and through, at the most profound level of explanation. The themes of cosmology and design are not proofs, but insights. And that is something that I would recommend that you learn. I think that very neatly sums up his position on the arguments for the existence of God, and it's therefore certainly something that you can bring into an essay in general on arguments for the existence of God. So rule that off, because that essentially, I would say, is section 3 there. It's mostly focused on the medieval times. He's going to now bring us forward a few centuries and talk really about what goes on, or what went on, in the 18th and the 19th centuries. So, here we go. Perhaps the unconscious recognition of natural theology as a search for understanding is why its second great flowering could occur in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, despite the severe contemporary criticisms of Hume and Kant. This movement had the character of a wholehearted appeal to the inspection of the world, in particular to the evidence of design, with its intricate and marvellously apt structure was held to reveal. Its leading figure was Archdeacon Paley, whose natural theology was long considered the outstanding English work of apologetic for theism. A later manifestation was provided by the Bridgewater Treatise, founded by a bequest by the 8th Earl of Bridgewater for books devoted to exhibiting the power, wisdom, and goodness of God as manifested in the creation, and with titles such as The Hand as Evincing Design. After all, the fitness of men and animals for life in their environments is a striking feature of the world that certainly cries out for explanation. Whatever logical prevailing might have come from the philosophers, the apparent signs of a widespread design were persuasive for the need of a designer. The precariousness of the quest for insight, arising from our limited powers of imagination of how things can come to be, was never more remarkably illustrated than when Darwin proposed an alternative mechanism whereby the differential selection of random variations effected by the means of the struggles for survival could lead to the appearance of design without the need for the intervention of a designer. It was the offering of an alternative insight, rather than a detailed philosophical criticism, which dealt a mortal blow to the natural theology of that day. That is an incredibly important point, of course, and it should remind you of Dawkins. And Dawkins says, and I'll just put this, write this onto the board for you here now, that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. And he says this in The Blind Watchmaker. The point is obviously that before you have an alternative hypothesis to explain how things appear to be designed when they aren't designed, all you've got are some things that are saying, well, I think there's a logical hole in your philosophical argument for the existence of God. But okay, great. So my solution is wrong. What's the answer then? As in, the question still burned within us until Darwin comes along. So this is why, of course, as we're going to see, Polkinghorne is going to try and offer us a sort of updated version of natural theology. And this, therefore, is the very present passage. Let's continue. Natural selection made sense in broad terms of the philosopher called, and also of the existence of the small differences between species in mutually isolated environments, such as the different types of finch found in separate islands of the Galapagos archipelago, which otherwise would seem to be acts of superabundant prodigality if they were special creations of the Creator. The subsequent advance of knowledge has made less and less plausible the invocation of the God of the Gaps, that shadowy deity whose only role was to explain the currently scientifically inexplicable. There are certainly many things that we do not understand. There is no agreement about whether the development of life is straightforwardly to be expected, given the right conditions of chemical environment, temperature, and radiation, or whether it is so unlikely that we must invoke the rather desperate remedy of supposing it to have arrived on Earth from somewhere else, what one might call the space being of the gaps theory of Francis Crick. Yet we have no reason to think that scientifically statable questions will not prove in the end to have scientifically statable answers, however hard they may be to find, and however how much they may turn out to require more knowledge than we have at our present disposal. This is one of the things he's talking about, if you like, the epistemological barrier. As in, we don't know stuff. Now, this is an amazing quotation, worthy of immediate committing to memory. So, I would take a couple of minutes out and learn this. The God of the Gaps is dead, and with him has died the old-style natural theology of Paley. And you can add, and the Bridgewater Treatise. No theologian may weep for them, for the gods of the gaps, hovering at the periphery of the known world, was far from being someone of whom it could be said that all understand that this is God. He was proposed as a sort of demiurge, a cause among the other competing causes of the world. When Aquinas spoke of God as first cause, he did not consider him thus as a jostling participant among the many efficient causes of the cosmic process. Rather, he is the ground of all that is in the world, and not to be identified with any part of its process. He is the author and producer of the play, not a particularly striking actor upon the stage. Okay, look at chapter 4. He comes back to this image then. It's so incredibly important because the God of Abraham is one who creates, as you remember, ex nihilo, out of nothing. A demiurge it uses pre-existing matter. So that's why it is a cause among causes. And this idea of this God of the Gaps is just a god of the philosophers, if you like, nothing really to do with what Aquinas is trying to talk about. Okay, he's going to bring in some other chap now. Torrance has made the interesting observation that the two great periods of natural theology's flourishing were also periods characterised by strongly dualistic thoughts about the world. The Middle Ages discriminated between the sensible world of brute perception and the intelligible world of spiritual apprehension. They drew a line between nature and supernature. In the 18th century, Cartesian dualism proclaimed a division between the extended substance of matter and the thinking substance of mind, while the deists sharply differentiated and detached God from the world that he had launched upon its way. The appeal of natural theology in both these ages lay in its ability to act as a logical bridge across the imposed gulf. It provided a way from one side to the other, as the grand scheme of the Summa Theologiae clearly illustrates. Torrance emphatically rejects the idea that natural theology is just a prior preparation for revealed theology, a warming up exercise before the real action starts. Rather, it is an integral part of the whole theological endeavour. If we reject a deistic disjunction between God and the world, which we are bound to do, natural theology cannot be pursued in its traditional abstractive form as a prior conceptual system on its own, but must be brought within the body of positive theology and pursued in indissoluble unity with it. No longer extrinsic, but intrinsic to the knowledge of God. It will function as a necessary infrastructure of theological science. And of course, theological science is the name of Polkinghorne's 6th chapter in this book. So, Torrance calls natural theology the epistemological geometry of revealed theology. In that somewhat curious phrase, he has in mind the analogy of the integration of geometry and mechanics that Einstein's general theory of relativity was brought about. The classical Newtonian view of the question was that space was the container in which particles of matter executed their mechanical interactions. In this view, geometry was a priori to physics. It described the stage on which the dynamical play was to be performed, just as the scene setters in the theatre can get on with their work in the absence of the actors, so geometrical thought was capable of being pursued in isolation from the consideration of the mechanics of matter. Euclid had his job to do, which Newton could then take over for his purposes. In general relativity, this is not the case. Space and matter, geometry and physics impinge upon each other. What we think of as the force of gravity is due to the curvature of space, which is itself due to the distribution of matter. While it may at times be profitable to concentrate one's attention on geometry and at times on matter, one is always conscious that they together form an integrated whole. Look, he keeps on and on saying phrases of this sort, so just kind of note when he talks about this. Two things that seem separate, working together when they're a whole in an integrated unity. It's very much his big thing, okay? It's Torrance's contention that the same is true of natural and revealed theology. His view is congenial to those of us who believe in the unity of knowledge, and who consequently think that theology must take account of all that we know about the world in the course of its inquiry. It is also consonant with the history of thought, for when we are seeking an understanding through and through, areas of expertise interact with each other and place mutual limitations on the interpretations which are conceivable. One only has to think of the modification of the tone of theological discourse that resulted from the transition from the three-decker universe of the world of antiquity to the vast universe discerned by modern cosmology, to get the point. Taking a contrary position is to risk relegating theology to an intellectual ghetto. Pannenberg has warned of the danger of distorting the historical revelation into a Gnostic knowledge of secrets, which follows from an understanding that puts revelation in contrast to, or even in conflict with, natural knowledge. In this view, natural theology is an essential study, not just an optional extra for those so inclined. So remember what we were saying about Karl Barth and the difference of opinion between him, I think, and Polkinghorne there on whether revelation is in fact of primary importance. Polkinghorne is so keen here to say that because, remember, God has created the world, it's got sort of his stamp on it, we can really come to a much deeper knowledge of the world and of its maker than just texts and sort of acts of revelation, because itself the world is a source of revelation. So he doesn't really want to separate the work of theology into sort of those camps of revelation versus natural theology. For him, the whole endeavour is essential together. I really like this next little phrase. Again, it's very, very short soundbite that you can remember. The Darwinian debacle, I just think is nicely alliterative. So the Darwinian debacle has had the effect of largely discrediting its pursuit for a century. Nevertheless, it's undergoing a welcome revival in our own time. This is occurring not so much in the hands of theologians, whose nerve, with some honourable exceptions, has not yet returned, but at the hands of the scientists. There has grown up a widespread feeling, especially among those who study fundamental physics, that there is more to the world than meets the eye. Science seems to throw out questions that point beyond itself and transcend its power to answer. They arise from recognizing the potentially inherent. They arise from recognizing the potentiality inherent in the structure of the world, its interlocking, tightly knit character, and indeed its very intelligibility, which makes it open to our inquiry. Thus, a physicist such as Paul Davies, who is notably unsympathetic to conventional religion, can nevertheless write, "It may be bizarre, but in my opinion, science offers a surer road to God than religion." It's a good little soundbite there for your work on science and religion, of course. Okay. We are concerned not only with a revived natural theology, but also with a revised natural theology. Okay. Take note, obviously, at the last bit of each chapter, one of the kind of good things about this book is that he really does repeat himself a lot, and the last sections of his chapters tend to state what he's just rabbited on about for a few pages. So do pay very close attention to them. It should help you anchor the meaning of the preceding chapter. And note the difference here. So it's revived and revised. It's revived because, of course, it was dead because of Darwin. And it's revised because we can't return to this idea of the God of the gaps. The God of the gaps, as you remember, is dead, and with him has died the old style natural theology of Paley. So if we can't have an old style natural theology, we need a new style natural theology, and so that is why he's reviving it and revising it. So he continues. It points to law and circumstance, using data of science, and so not open to scientific inquiry, rather than to particular concerns, such as the coming to be of life or the eye. These latter questions are legitimate subjects for scientific investigation, and the attempt to capture them for theology is just the error of the God of the gaps. On the other hand, reforming matters of law and circumstance are part of the founding of faith of science, which it has to assume on the basis of its inquiry. They bring us back to the themes of cosmology and design, pursued at a deeper level than the scientific, in a search for the fullest possible understanding of the world. Is that phrase again? The insights thus obtained must find their integration within the totality of theological thinking. These are the tasks to which we must address ourselves in the chapters that follow. The purpose of this chapter has been to show that this intellectual quest is a continuation of a long and fruitful tradition of religious thought. Okay. And he's going to go on to talk about the openness world. Remember, he talked about the natural theology versus revelation, and that we need both. God is atemporal, that the five ways are insights, and I think that there's common ground to understanding. Common ground, that is, between science and theology. So, end of chapter 1.